Alright folks, lately I've been looking towards the progress made in restoring society within the Walking Dead universe, and one of the most prominent aspects of this return to civility is the rebirth of long-form travel throughout the Wasteland. As we know, the early days of the outbreak saw most forms of modern transportation completely collapse, which led to survivors in the middle years embracing a more primitive way of life, before experiencing the beginnings of its return altogether in the modern day. So today, I wanted to break down what led to each shift, the most prominent forms of travel in each era, and what this progress means for the future of the franchise. Or in simpler terms, I'm gonna bring you the history of planes, trains, and automobiles in the Walking Dead universe. Oh, and also boats. And whatever else doesn't fit with that reference. But with that, if you end up enjoying this video, I'd greatly appreciate it if you hit that like button and subscribe to see more content like this. All of the above really helps my channel in the algorithm. Now, to understand how long-form transportation has begun returning in the Wasteland, we have to understand how it was lost. On August 27th, 2010, the dead began to walk the earth, leading to the complete and utter collapse of society over the following days as survivors scrambled to escape cities. But as most freeways became gridlocked due to unprecedented levels of traffic, many civilians were forced to leave their vehicles as they stood before fleeing for their lives, leaving graveyards of cars across the country that acted as both a hindrance and benefit for those left behind. At the very least, these civilians were able to run. The same couldn't be said for those in the air, as they were left with very little luck. You see, the Fear the Walking Dead Flight 462 webisode depicts survivors on a commercial airline over Los Angeles during Monument Day who find themselves trapped above the clouds as the world collapses below them. Here, a man passes from the symptoms of a concealed bite on board, leading to a feeding frenzy that ultimately leaves the plane nosediving into the ocean. It's unclear exactly how many aircrafts plummeted to the ground on this day, but we know Flight 462 was far from the last, as this occurred on a large enough scale that some children who witnessed this firsthand all the way in downtown Lincoln, Nebraska went on to refer to this event as the night the sky fell as they got older. Fighter jets were slamming into buildings, helicopters were crashing down to the ground below. It was absolute chaos while presumably occurring everywhere. And although the franchise only touches on this topic a bit, if I were to guess, this was predominantly due to a mixture of people turning on planes, the fleeing of air traffic control, the darkening of cities across the country, limiting vision, and the possible overrunning of airports as travelers attempted and failed to flee home, leaving these pilots with a time limit to find somewhere safe to land or risk the loss of fuel mid-flight. Yes, a lot of these aircraft have onboard instruments for navigation, but visual cues and ATC guidance are equally as important, especially for landing, so hopefully most had enough fuel and luck to at least last through the night. We see through the torn apart webisode, helicopters were sent into smaller towns in an effort to evacuate civilians to bigger cities, as the government believed they would be easier to protect in one place. But as the dead began to overrun these so-called protected populations, the sound of helicopter blades over the cities became a very grim warning, as approximately 12 days after the initial outbreak, Operation Cobalt was enacted, a last resort attempt by the US government to contain the dead by dropping napalm on every major metropolitan city in the country via helicopter, which assured the doom of America for years to come. However, as we learn in Season 2, this wasn't quite the end of modern transportation, as Dave and Tony convey rumors of trains transporting people from the coast to Nebraska, as there was a low population and high amount of guns. While never explicitly confirmed to be the destination of these trains, The Walking Dead World Beyond introduces us to the campus colony and Super Colony of Omaha, an entire city and college campus that was protected during the early days and has thrived with a high population ever since. which could suggest those rumors from Dave and Tony were correct. Although, by the time we meet these colonies around 10 years post-outbreak, we see no trains, or any vehicles for that matter, still in their possession. So despite prospering in some departments and functioning as allies, perhaps long-form transportation was of little concern as the resources often came to them. As for boats, well, they were definitely the most reliable form of transportation during the early days, but that doesn't mean they were without issue. In some cases, such as what we see in Daryl Dixon, survivors were able to sail out on the open ocean for many months with little issue, but sooner or later, those at sea will run out of resources, forcing them to return to land and face the horrors like any other. On some very unlucky occasions, pirates along the coastlines would ambush and capsize ships while leaving those aboard for dead. If you were lucky enough to avoid said pirates, well, hopefully the dead didn't leave you stranded by clogging up your engines, and for the love of God, stay out of the water. It's unclear if large vessels could have been out there surviving during this time, but if they were, they'd likely face the same issues of running out of resources. We do see one giant decrepit ship that once acted as a safe haven in The Ones Who Live, but as mentioned, the need to return to land had assured its failure like any other. Even submarines weren't safe, as a single walker could bring the entire crew to their knees given their confined surroundings. Regardless, I think it's safe to say in the months following the outbreak and Operation Cobalt, the skies, streets, and ocean became far quieter than anything humanity has experienced in centuries. For those braving the wasteland following these cataclysmic events, jumping between abandoned cars and trucks would become the primary method of travel for the next couple years. At least for those they could jumpstart, as many batteries had long died, leaving roads blocked but with a ton of loot behind. I mentioned this in my Return of Power video, but a frequent complaint I see regarding the Walking Dead universe, especially in the first 8 seasons, is the abundance of usable gas left behind. Now, I'm no expert, but from what I could find, fuel does go bad, but doesn't automatically become useless. Over a couple years, it would be watered down for sure and could potentially gum up your engines, but if you're just hopping from car to car while siphoning what you can along the way, this could have been a reliable form of transportation for up to 3 years before it really became unusable. So although it was temporary, these vehicle graveyards became valuable sources of fuel for those passing through. On extremely rare occasions, it was possible to see a functioning military helicopter flying through the clouds during the first year or so, as some surviving soldiers have been surveying the metropolitan areas as they were left in the dark by the government as much as any other. But of course, in time, announcing your location to the entire wasteland would prove to be a fatal mistake, as within only a year or so, most remnants of the army had fallen either to the dead or at the hands of raiders coming for what they have, leaving the skies to fall silent. Well, unless you were a part of the CRM. In that case, essentially everything we've talked about doesn't apply. You see, as our survivors were eating worms or digging through garbage, those who were once a part of the Pennsylvania National Guard were dominating the clouds with little to no opposition countrywide within the first couple years following the outbreak. This was due to the guardsmen fighting back against the US Air Force and preventing Operation Cobalt from destroying Philadelphia at the command of Major General Beale, which led to their army reforming into the Civic Republic military, as the US Air Force and by extension remaining government vanished, leaving Philadelphia populated and thriving under Civic Republic rule. With the CRM's existence, it's hard to say modern forms of transportation ever fully disappeared, as despite only seeing their presence come Season 8, they had been producing their own fuel and oil through various means since the beginning, which allowed the CR to discover the campus colony, Omaha, and another surviving city, Portland, via air travel before establishing an allyship called the Alliance of Three. And although it doesn't appear the CRM gave these allied colonies vehicles of any kind, we do see other independent super colonies such as the Commonwealth producing their own fuel all the same. It wasn't quite to the same extent as the CRM, as they didn't have access to air travel, but they were able to get vehicles back on the road through creating biofuel nonetheless. So although pre-apocalypse forms of transportation did still exist, unless you were within one of these super colonies, you'd be forced to revert to a more primitive, yet adaptive way of life without even knowing of the larger world around you. Well, at least for the first 5 or so years, as some groups were eventually able to incorporate the past with the present a bit better than others. Take coastal communities who had turned back towards the sea for fishing via sailboats, for example, or groups over in Texas who were briefly experimenting with rather unique forms of travel, such as flight through hot air balloons. But for the most part, living in the Wasteland in this era just meant your average survivor was going to be traveling on horseback, as the once useful, yet expired gas had either been used up or become too oxidized and degraded. Some survivors would get creative by replacing horses with walkers as they never ran out of energy, but besides that, transportation had mostly reverted to pulling carriages, sometimes through repurposing old world vehicles, which is actually pretty cool. Much like Alexandria itself, this was a union of past and present technology. And this was the way of life for most for the better part of a decade to come. But eventually, despite the challenges faced living out in the Wasteland, some smaller coalitions such as the Pioneers were able to begin producing their own fuel once again, independent from the super colonies, by repopulating the oil sands, which would continue even after the bombs dropped through Luciana's independent work for years to come. However, not all were as fortunate to have access to old world ways of producing gas, so a frequent alternative method of creating gas had emerged through fermenting and distilling corn. However, there was only so much that could be produced as it required a large amount of crops, so more often than not, this was on an extremely small scale. For example, Daryl's bike during Season 9 and 10. Eugene could only produce enough to get it running while everything else was horse-based. However, come our DC-based coalition's union with the Commonwealth, this divide had started to become less prominent as the Commonwealth had begun sharing its resources with Alexandria due to the damage caused by the Whisperer War around 10 to 11 years in. For the first time in nearly a decade, Alexandria had running vehicles within its walls, but unfortunately, this was mostly just in preparation to annex the communities, as our survivors were imprisoned and forced to work in labor camps dedicated to constructing brand new railways between the communities. Despite the CRM appearing far more advanced than any other society, this was the first time we've seen trains return since the early days, which caught most by surprise. And following the Commonwealth Revolution and 1 year final time jump which saw our survivors take back control of their homes and lives, this railway was fully established and was traveled frequently by those commuting from Ohio to the east. It's clear this was a turning point for the Wasteland, as modern technology was beginning to return to smaller colonies. And this was only amplified following the destruction of the CRM's entire malevolent sector during the Ones Who Lives finale at the hands of Rick and Michonne Grimes. Not only did this save the survivors of America from the sadistic force of the CRM, who were preparing to exterminate anybody who wasn't them in the name of self-preservation, but it allowed for a complete reform of the military that saw it delivering resources to other colonies via helicopter. It's unclear exactly where these supply drops were headed, but come Daryl Dixon's Season 1, we see an increase of functioning vehicles in areas that should be plagued in anarchy. Take the mechanics yard in Maine, for example. It's hard to say for certain whether or not these types of civilized collections of hardened survivors began developing before or after the reforming of the CRM, but judging by how common it's become for regular survivors outside coalitions to have access to this biofuel, and the nature of their open doorway of taking in work from passerbys rather than fearing strangers, it seems like the anarchist way of life is beginning to fade due to these super colonies becoming more active and expanding in the surrounding states. It's much harder to get away with plundering communities when various armies are patrolling the streets all around. And why would you want to anyway when you can just loot some abandoned ruins and trade your goods for a few tanks at the nearest Commonwealth outpost? I'll be honest, it's entirely possible these guys did just make their own ethanol, or I guess found it. But look how organized they are. They even have long-form radio communication set up. And most of them talk about having people back home, so to me, this seems like something that was set up by one of the superpowers to help jumpstart the reclamation process without having to do the work themselves. But that doesn't mean independent survivors weren't capable of making their own biofuel. Such is the case with Ash, who was able to produce enough to gas up his plane and fly it all the way across the Atlantic, marking the first instance of intercontinental travel via air we've seen on screen as Carol and Ash arrive safely in Paris. Despite France still being largely overrun by the dead, organizations such as Pavor were in possession of functioning fueled-up shipping vessels intended to transport walkers from America to France with the prospect of using them for their experiments. Clearly, if a post-apocalyptic society is able to produce heavy fuel oil, they are far more advanced than what we've been shown. But how is this the case if France is still largely plagued in anarchy? Well, that brings us to Great Britain. Now, I've recently made a video discussing the island's possible survival evident from the Daryl Dixon Season 2 finale, but I think this could explain how the French were in possession of this vessel. If the island largely survived the outbreak and its population mostly maintained, it can be assumed their gas and oil production sites survived all the same, so I can absolutely see this fuel being something they trade to neighboring countries. It has been inferred multiple times England is a hub for sea travel in the modern day, as they are the source of the boats that are supposed to take Daryl back to America. Meaning intercontinental travel is not only possible in the modern apocalyptic day, but may actually be a lot more frequent than we had initially assumed. And with that, we've reached the farthest point in the timeline we've seen so far, Dead City, which is said to be set 17 years post-outbreak, where we see the increase of vehicles within Daryl Dixon expanded on. Here, some coalitions have doubled down on corn fuel distilling and have managed to maintain vast fields of crops for their production. Take New Babylon, for example, a relatively new society that has used these means to restore power to their streets, and by extension have put vehicles back on the roads on a much larger scale, as your average survivor once again has access to usable gas in most areas out in the east. You know, as long as they have something to trade. Although through Negan's accounts of the years since the Commonwealth Revolution, it seems like despite long-form transportation returning on a rather large scale, some survivors still live a pioneer-esque lifestyle, as he states he put Annie and his son on a wagon train to Missouri and hasn't seen them since. With the abundance of travel methods and colonies emerging in the modern day, most who still live this lifestyle more than likely do so by choice. But through the progress made by those adapting to what the world is now, it's clear there is no obstacle humanity can't overcome. And with the emergence of walkers becoming an abundant and reliable source of fuel within Dead City, it's quite possible the Walking Dead universe could be entering the golden era of transportation. We've seen the return of cars, aircraft, boats, and trains over the last few years. And if these societies keep expanding the way they are, I don't see why the entire country, and eventually the world, can't be connected once again. As of now in the timeline, it is just as common to see a horse and carriage as it is to see a motorcycle on a road. which is really crazy to say, as at one point it appeared like the world was dead. So I guess only time will tell if this progress in transportation will maintain, or maybe come crashing down all over again. But I'm curious to hear what you guys think. How far do you believe the return of society will really go? Will roads be cleaned up and repaired? Will rail lines continue expanding to the various colonies? Or do you think it's only a matter of time before everything falls apart again? I want to hear all your thoughts in the comments down below. But that's gonna do it for me today, folks. As always, thank you so much for watching.